The evening of December 2nd, 1976, settled over Leningrad like a sheet of cold metal. Frost clung to the windows of the 5-story Khrushchevka building on Polyostrovsky Prospect, and every sound seemed muffled by winter's weight. Inside apartment 27, a 16-year-old girl named Alina Voronina stood in the hallway, holding her school satchel against her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. Her mother had just asked a question she could not yet answer. Why had the school summoned them again, so suddenly, so formally, with no explanation except that it was a matter of urgency? Before Alina could respond, a knock echoed through the apartment. Hard, measured, official. Her father looked up instinctively. He had heard that kind of knock before, once as a boy when his own uncle vanished overnight after a neighbor whispered something about incorrect remarks made during a factory lunch break. That knock had become a relic of a country that promised it had changed. But memory carries a longer half-life than ideology. Some sounds never lose their meaning. He opened the door slowly. 2 men stood in the dim corridor. Plain black coats. Fur hats dusted with snowflakes melting into their collars. They did not introduce themselves. They did not need to. Every adult in the Soviet Union knew the posture, the silence, the cold efficiency. The taller man spoke first, his voice low and almost polite, the kind of politeness that hides a blade. "Comrade Voronin, we need your daughter to come with us. The school administration requested that we accompany her. There is a matter concerning a piece of writing she submitted." For a moment, Alina thought her heartbeat would give her away. She felt it hammering against her ribs like a small animal desperate to escape. Her school essay, 8 pages written in blue ink. A simple assignment. Describe your favorite piece of literature and what it teaches us about truth. Truth. She had written about truth. Her mother stepped forward sharply, her voice cracking. "Is she in trouble?" The shorter official offered a brief shake of the head. "Not at all. This is routine. We prefer to clarify these issues quickly. It avoids misunderstandings." That word, misunderstandings, felt like a trapdoor opening beneath them. In the hallway behind her, the apartment felt suddenly small, suffocating. The wallpaper's faded floral pattern, the coat rack leaning slightly to one side, the smell of boiled cabbage from the kitchen, all of it collapsed into a blur as Alina's mind tried to grasp what was happening. She had not planned anything. She had not intended anything. She had only written what she believed. That literature should seek truth. That stories should illuminate life, not hide it behind slogans and mandatory optimism. Her father cleared his throat. "She is a child. Surely any misunderstanding can be addressed with us present." The taller man's expression remained neutral. "Procedure requires that we speak to her first." That word again. Procedure. In the Soviet Union, procedure meant inevitability. Alina stepped into the corridor before her parents could protest further. The air smelled of wet coats and the faint tang of industrial cleaner used earlier that morning. The stairwell bulb flickered above them, buzzing lightly, casting stuttering shadows across the concrete walls. As they descended, each step echoed upward like a countdown. She clutched the wooden railing to steady herself. Her breath condensed in small, cold clouds. The men did not touch her. They did not threaten her. And yet the sense of coercion hung between them like a taut wire. When they reached the first-floor landing, something made her look back up the stairwell. Her mother stood at the top, holding the railing, her face pale and rigid with fear she dared not show openly. Her eyes were wide, pleading, helpless. The image carved itself into Alina's memory with surgical precision. The taller man gestured toward the building's exit. This will not take long. But the girl already understood that something irreversible had begun. Not because she had broken a law, not because she had joined any forbidden movement, but because she had written an essay that expressed a simple, unapproved idea. And in the Soviet Union of 1976, a thought written on paper could become a lifelong sentence. Outside, the cold hit her face like a slap. A black Volga waited near the curb, engine running, breath of exhaust rising into the winter air. She hesitated. The shorter officer opened the back door. "Please, Comrade Voronina, it is only a conversation." But Alina had already stepped across an invisible threshold, and she sensed it even then. Her life, her family's life, had split into a before and an after. She entered the car. The door closed. The Volga slid away from the curb, and in the apartment above, her mother pressed a shaking hand against the frosted window pane, watching until the red taillights disappeared into the gray Soviet evening, not knowing that the week ahead would dismantle their family forever. The Volga moved through Leningrad's evening traffic, like a silent black insect drifting between trolley buses, grinding along frozen rails and intersections where red stars glowed weakly above government buildings. The heater inside the car breathed heavy warmth that fogged the windows until the outside world dissolved into streaks of amber and gray. Alina kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid to touch anything, afraid even to move, while the two men beside her sat in calm silence with the confidence of people who served a vast system in which the fate of one schoolgirl required no urgency. Their stillness reminded her that once the state began to watch someone, everything unfolded according to rules no ordinary citizen ever learned. In the blurred reflection, she saw her own pale face, and her thoughts slid back to the moment all of this had begun 2 days earlier. It had been a dull Tuesday morning, the sort of winter day when the city felt drained of all color. Her literature teacher, Marina Filipovna, sat alone in the school office grading essays, while the courtyard outside lay empty, except for collapsing patches of dirty snow. The radiator clattered behind her, filling the room with the metallic smell of overheated pipes. She flipped through the usual parade of safe phrases about patriotic duty and collective triumph, her mind drifting until she reached Alina's essay. She recognized the slanted handwriting at once. The first paragraph softened her expression. The second tightened it. By the fourth, her palms were damp. Alina had written about Turgenev's fathers and sons, not through the required ideological lens, but through the quiet suffering of people forced to swallow truths they could not voice. She wrote about the cost of silence, about lives bent under fear. And then came the sentence that froze Marina. Literature must not serve fear, but illuminate it. She reread it several times as dread gathered in her chest. The essay was brilliant, sincere, and dangerously unguarded. She remembered her father whispering to her long ago that truths must be handled carefully because walls remember everything. Now, at 48, a widow supporting 2 sons and an elderly mother, she understood that a single unreported sentence could jeopardize their future. If someone else found the essay, she would be accused of negligence, a stain that destroyed careers and shut doors for generations. With shame pressing against her ribs, she picked up the telephone and prayed no one would answer. But after the 3rd ring, a bureaucratic voice calmly instructed her to deliver the essay the next morning. When she set the receiver down, a coldness settled inside her. The following day, officials took the papers, asked measured questions, and gave nothing away. That night, she barely slept. The next day, 2 men in ordinary clothing returned and questioned her again, watching her closely, and she understood that the machine had already begun to turn. Now, as the Volga carried Alina past the winter city, she had no idea that it was her teacher's fear, not her own writing, that had placed her in this car. The vehicle turned toward a low building with covered windows, and the shorter officer finally spoke, assuring her they needed only clarification. But his voice carried the unsettling calm of someone who already knew her path was fixed. When the car stopped, Alina stepped into the icy air, unaware that decisions made far from her sight had already sealed her fate. and that their consequences were now moving steadily toward her. The corridor inside the administrative building felt colder than the street outside, filled with the sharp smell of disinfectant and old linoleum that clung to Soviet offices like something permanent. Alina walked between the two men who guided her without touching her, their silence forming a boundary she dared not cross, as she sensed each step carrying her deeper into a system that usually remained invisible until it decided to notice someone. They led her into a small room with a metal table and 3 chairs, its bare walls broken only by a large calendar printed in heavy red ink, while the bulb overhead hummed faintly and made the shadows tremble. The shorter official gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed quickly, placing her satchel at her feet like a student unprepared for a lesson she could not anticipate. The taller man opened a folder and removed her essay, the corners worn from repeated handling, and spread the pages across the table as if arranging evidence. His expression carried no accusation, only the calm detachment of someone serving a process much larger than himself. His gentle voice frightened her more than a harsh one would have, as he asked why she chose the book she had written about. She explained that she liked its humanity, the way its characters felt real rather than heroic. He nodded and took notes, then asked what she meant when she wrote that truth should not be shaped by fear. She hesitated, unsure whether honesty had a place in this room, and finally said that literature should help people understand themselves and reflect life without disguising its difficulties. The younger man leaned forward and asked if anyone had influenced her ideas, if she had read anything outside the school library, if political topics were ever discussed at home. Each question pressed heavier on her, and when she paused even for a moment, he noticed, and she saw his expression sharpen. That hesitation would follow her family for years. The men continued questioning her in calm voices, never threatening, never accusing, which made the exchange feel colder than open hostility. At one point, the taller man even smiled, a small, patient smile that unsettled her because it suggested he had already formed his conclusion. He slid the essay toward her and asked if she believed the state used fear to control people. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she stared at the line she had written days earlier with innocent conviction, and she managed to say she had no intention of criticizing the state and only wanted to write honestly. The men exchanged a look she could not read, an expression not of anger or approval, but of quiet evaluation. The questioning lasted nearly an hour before they told her she could leave. Her legs trembled as she stood, and the shorter official opened the door without reassurance or warning, as if nothing significant had happened. In the hallway, an older woman passed carrying forms without glancing at her, and the indifference felt like its own message. Outside, the city looked unchanged with its fog and street lamps, yet she sensed something vast had taken notice of her, and no longer saw her as simply a student, but as a deviation. The officials told her she could walk home, and that the school would contact her parents in the morning, their politeness colder than the winter air. As she walked toward the tram stop, she realized she did not know what awaited her family. She had committed no crime, but in a system like this, punishment required no crime at all, only a small deviation. On the tram, she watched her reflection in the frosted window and barely recognized herself, unaware that an invisible crack had already formed beneath her family's life, one that would widen quietly in the days to come. When Alina stepped into the apartment that evening, the warmth felt unfamiliar, as though she had returned from a place that had drained something essential from her. She closed the door quietly, hoping to slip past her parents and reach her room unnoticed. But her mother stood at the kitchen counter chopping onions, the sharp scent mixing with the faint smell of gas from the stove. Her father sat at the table reading an old newspaper with the weary focus of a man who depended on routine to keep the world steady. Neither of them noticed her at first, but when her mother turned and saw the expression on her face, everything changed. She asked what had happened, the question soft yet trembling, and it made hiding the truth impossible. Alina tried to speak, but her voice cracked before she could form words. Her father folded his newspaper and set it aside, watching her with the stillness of someone seeing a storm gather too close to home. She told them everything: the officials, the office, the questions. Nothing could be left out, because even the memory felt heavy and unreal. Her mother covered her mouth as she listened, while her father sat unmoving, the silence expanding until it filled the whole kitchen. When he finally stood and paced from the window to the table, he asked to see the assignment. She explained that the officials had taken it. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something old and buried had risen within him, a fear he had kept hidden for years. He asked if she had repeated anything she heard at home. She said no. He asked again, and this time she felt the desperation behind the question. She reassured him that she had spoken only about literature and the ideas she believed mattered. Her mother began to cry softly, the sound small but overwhelming in the confined room. The apartment suddenly felt too small to contain the dread growing inside it. Her father sat beside her, held her hand, and told her it might be nothing, that perhaps the officials had only been doing their job. But his eyes gave away what he knew, that unguarded thoughts could travel, and that families had unraveled over far less. He walked back to the window and stared into the courtyard, where children played in the snow and neighbors went about their evening. Everything looked normal, yet he felt the presence of something unseen moving beneath the surface, something that preferred silence and obedience. Her mother asked whether the school had ever contacted them before. Alina shook her head. She was a good student. Her father nodded but remained distant, his mind already imagining decisions made in rooms they would never see. When they finally sat at the table, their tea had cooled, and her father told her she must not speak of the matter to anyone, not a classmate, neighbor, or friend. He spoke calmly, because fear in a parent could shatter a child faster than any official could. That night, her parents whispered in the kitchen long after she had gone to her room. Her mother wanted to visit the school in the morning, but her father warned against it, saying that appearing anxious could make them seem guilty. In her room, Alina lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though she had stepped into a tunnel with no visible end. The silence outside pressed against the windows and settled into the corners of her room. She had once believed that literature was a place where truth could exist freely, but now she understood that even thoughts written in ink could become dangerous. The week ahead had already begun to take shape, and although she did not yet know it, each passing day would pull her family deeper into a slow and methodical unraveling that none of them would escape unchanged. By morning, the apartment felt colder than the weather outside, and Alina dressed slowly, her fingers trembling as she buttoned her uniform blouse. The air seemed heavier than before, as if every step required effort. Her mother urged her to eat, but she could not swallow more than a few bites, and her father walked her to the door and checked the hallway twice before letting her leave. The quiet between them carried all the fear they could not name. The tram ride to school felt endless, its fogged windows blurring the tired faces around her. Every time the tram slowed, her heart tightened, imagining someone waiting for her, even though the officials had said nothing about returning. Fear did not need reason to survive. At the school gate, she noticed something was wrong. The vice principal stood outside checking a clipboard, watching each student closely, and when her gaze rested on Alina, she gave a small, stiff nod that made Alina's stomach twist. Inside, the corridors seemed muffled, conversations low and footsteps soft, as though the building itself sensed trouble. When she entered class, students looked up, then quickly away. They knew something. Her literature teacher avoided her eyes completely, her hands trembling as she opened her book, and Alina felt a painful mix of betrayal and pity. Halfway through the lesson, a knock came, and the secretary entered calling Alina's name. The class fell silent, as she followed her into a small office where a man in a dark suit waited. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were cold as he asked about her essay, her reading habits, and whether her family discussed forbidden books. He listened carefully, studying every hesitation. When he asked if she believed fear existed in the country, she answered cautiously, offering a safe and vague reply. He dismissed her soon after, but she sensed that something had already shifted. Teachers watched her as she walked back, and students whispered in clusters. When she returned home, her parents were waiting, their faces tense. And after she told them what happened, her father said they would have to be very careful now. They had stepped into a corridor with doors quietly closing behind them and no clear path ahead. The next morning arrived under the same gray sky, but the air felt sharper, and Alina sensed the change before she even opened her eyes. Her parents moved around the apartment with a careful silence that deepened her unease, and her father left early pretending it was for work, although the way he kissed her mother's forehead revealed more fear than routine. As she walked to school, the streets seemed to watch her, and every window felt like an eye following her steps. Nothing in the city had changed, yet everything looked altered, as though a thin layer of glass had formed between her and the world, making each familiar shape appear distorted. At school, the atmosphere pressed in around her. Students whispered near the lockers, casting quick glances that vanished when she looked back. A girl who usually shared her desk offered a smile that disappeared as soon as it appeared. Teachers behaved strangely with Marina Filipovna, avoiding her completely by fussing with the blinds, and the geography and mathematics teachers speaking with an unnatural stiffness, as though they had been warned to treat her with caution. Near midday, when the bell rang for break, a soft voice called her name from the doorway. It was her friend Katya, who normally smiled easily, but today looked frightened. She led Alina into a stairwell landing and fidgeted with her gloves, before explaining that she had overheard teachers whispering that the essay had been reported to an outside office, and that the school had been instructed to monitor Alina. They had used the phrase, ideological deviation. The words sent a coldness through Alina that made it difficult to breathe. She thanked Katya, who squeezed her hand, and quickly left, afraid to be seen with her for too long. When classes ended, Alina walked home slowly and noticed a black Volga parked near her building with dark windows that made her pause before she forced herself onward, convincing herself it was coincidence, even as fear tightened inside her. At home, her parents listened, and her father admitted he had suspected this would happen. He told her that institutions often tested families by observing their reactions, and that they must remain calm and predictable. They must give no one reason to believe anything beyond a misunderstanding. As night settled, the apartment grew smaller, and every footstep in the hallway made her mother tense. A soft knock sounded once, and then faded into the stairwell, leaving the family frozen in silence. Later in her room, Alina lay awake listening to the hum of the pipes, and sensing that the week was moving towards something irreversible. She could not yet understand that her ordinary life was already crumbling into danger, shaped by decisions made far from her sight. 5 days after the essay first disappeared into official hands, the investigation moved beyond the school without anyone telling the family. It began in an office Alina would never see, a narrow room, where 2 men leaned over a file that contained her picture, her school records, and a typewritten summary of her assignment. The language inside the report was measured, but unmistakable. Possible ideological instability. Monitor household. Determine source of influence. Her teacher had not intended for anything so formal to unfold. She had simply delivered the essay to the vice principal, who had passed it to the district education committee, who had then forwarded it to a regional supervisor, who forwarded it again to the department responsible for youth ideological compliance. By the time it landed on the desk of these 2 anonymous men, the decision was no longer personal. It was procedural. They reviewed her background, her father's work history, the years when her family had lived near the Finnish border, the record of her older brother, who had once applied for an exit visa and been denied without explanation. That detail alone changed the tone of the room. One of the officials closed the file and leaned back as if the story had suddenly become familiar. Dissatisfaction rarely came from nowhere. It spread through families like mold. That afternoon, the school received a quiet instruction. The headmaster was to document Alina's interactions with classmates and record anything unusual. Her literature teacher was told to grade her neutrally and avoid personal conversations. The school counselor was told to schedule a meeting with her parents. None of these directives required threats. The system relied on obedience that came naturally from fear. At home, the atmosphere tightened further. Alina's father returned each evening pale from the strain of pretending nothing was wrong. Her mother tried to cook, but often forgot ingredients. Alina felt her parents trying to protect her, but their silence made everything worse. Every hour seemed to bring a new sign that someone was thinking about them, examining them, deciding something about their future. 2 days later, when Alina walked into school, she noticed a man she had never seen before, standing near the entrance pretending to read a bulletin board. He wore a worker's coat and kept his hat low, but his posture was wrong for a factory laborer. Throughout the day, she saw him again near the courtyard, then later near the gate, timing his presence with the ringing of the bells. By evening, she understood what her father already feared. They were no longer waiting for the situation to escalate. They were already observed, evaluated, measured. The decision would not happen suddenly. It would unfold quietly, like everything else in their week of unraveling. The next morning began with a silence that felt heavier than the day before. Alina's father left early again, but this time he hesitated at the door, as though afraid something would happen the moment he stepped outside. Her mother busied herself with small tasks, rearranging dishes, sweeping floors, wiping clean surfaces that were already spotless. It was the kind of nervous work that tried to hide fear, but only revealed it more clearly. On her way to school, Alina sensed movement behind her. Footsteps not too close yet, not distant enough to be harmless. She turned once, saw nothing unusual, and convinced herself she was imagining it. But when she reached the courtyard gate, she glanced back and caught a figure slipping behind the corner of a building. A man in a dark coat, the same build as the one she had seen near the entrance the day before. Inside the school, the hallways were strangely quiet. Students spoke in hushed tones. Some avoided her entirely. Others offered quick, sympathetic glances, then turned away as if afraid someone might see them showing kindness. Her teachers behaved cautiously. Her literature teacher did not look at her even once. During lunch, the school counselor requested to see her. The counselor's office was warm but overly tidy, papers stacked so precisely that the room felt prepared for inspection. The counselor spoke softly, asking how she felt, whether she was stressed, whether everything at home was stable. Each question sounded harmless, yet carried the weight of official curiosity. Alina answered carefully, aware that honesty could be misinterpreted and silence could be suspicious. She left the office with a strange tightness in her chest. It felt like the walls of the school had begun to close in around her. When classes ended, the man in the dark coat stood across the street pretending to smoke. His eyes never left her. She walked home at a steady pace, refusing to look back again, but she could feel him following at a distance. At the stairwell of her building, she paused to listen. For several seconds, only the distant hum of traffic filled the air. She climbed the stairs quickly, heart pounding. As she reached the landing, she heard a creak below. A footstep, a body shifting weight. Inside the apartment, she locked the door and slid the bolt into place. Her parents immediately noticed her shaking hands. She told them about the man following her. Her mother collapsed into a chair, pressing a hand to her forehead. Her father closed his eyes with a slow exhale, as if he had finally heard the confirmation of what he already knew. The surveillance was no longer subtle. It had become deliberate. visible enough to frighten them, yet controlled enough to avoid causing panic. The purpose was clear: pressure, observation, waiting for a misstep. That night, the family barely spoke. Alina lay awake, listening to footsteps echo in the stairwell long after midnight. She understood now that their lives were not merely changing. They were being measured by people who did not need evidence, only suspicion. And once suspicion took root in the Soviet system, it rarely let go. The following morning arrived with a sharp, brittle cold that seemed to seep through the apartment walls. Nobody had slept well, not even for an hour. Every creak in the stairwell, every hiss of the radiators sounded like a warning. Alina found her father already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. He looked older than he had the night before. Her mother hovered near the stove, pretending to prepare breakfast, though nothing was cooking. A knock on the door made all three of them freeze. Not loud, not urgent, but official. Her father motioned for silence and approached the door slowly. When he asked who it was, a familiar voice answered. It was the school's deputy headmaster requesting to speak with the family. Her father opened the door only halfway, keeping his hand on the frame as if bracing himself. The deputy headmaster stepped inside, looking uncomfortable, as though he wished he were anywhere else. He held a thin folder under his arm and avoided eye contact. He explained that a district committee representative would be visiting the school that week and that certain student matters required clarification before the inspection. He used careful words, neutral words, but every sentence felt like it had been rehearsed with fear. He insisted that Alina return to school the next day for a follow-up interview. Mandatory. Her mother protested, saying she needed rest, that the officials had frightened her. The man merely repeated the word, mandatory. After he left, her father shut the door and turned the lock with a shaking hand. He told Alina she would not go. His voice was firm, steady, in a way that startled her. He said they would keep her home until he understood what was happening. He would go to his old friend at the municipal archive to ask for advice, someone who had survived similar scrutiny years ago. But even as he spoke, determination in his tone, there was something hollow in his eyes, as though he knew the limits of defiance in a system like theirs. By midday, the man in the dark coat appeared again, standing near the courtyard entrance, pretending to read a newspaper. He remained there for hours, watching, waiting. Inside the apartment, the family sat together in silence, each of them aware that refusing the interview would not protect Alina. It would only escalate attention. The machine had started turning, and now it would come for them whether they opened the door or not. The end arrived without declarations or signatures. It came in the form of a recommendation, delivered politely, folded inside an official envelope, stating that Alina's presence at school number 143 was no longer conducive to a harmonious learning environment. The language was soft, almost gentle, but the meaning was as blunt as a hammer. She was to be transferred immediately to a vocational school in a district far from home. The kind of school children were sent to when someone, somewhere, had decided their future should be small. Her parents read the paper twice, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into mercy. But they didn't. The decision had been made days earlier, perhaps the moment she hesitated in that interrogation room, perhaps the moment her teacher lifted the phone. The state never announced guilt. It simply redirected lives until they folded into quiet compliance. They were given 3 days. Those days passed like a fever. Her mother packed clothes in silence. Her father made phone calls that led nowhere. Every door he knocked on closed with the same expressionless refusal. No one argued with recommendations. No one risked their own stability for a girl who had written something too honest. On the morning she was to leave, the apartment felt emptied of color. Breakfast sat untouched on the table. Her mother tried to speak, but her voice kept breaking. Her father stood stiffly by the door, hands behind his back as though standing at his own sentencing. When they reached the station, the platform was nearly deserted. A cold wind pushed through the gaps in the walls, carrying the metallic scent of rails and the distant clatter of freight cars. The train arrived with a low groan. Steam enveloped the platform. For a moment, Alina could barely see her parents. Then the fog thinned and she saw her mother's trembling hands, her father's rigid jaw, their faces carved with helplessness. She hugged them both. Her mother whispered that this would pass. Her father whispered nothing. His silence said everything. When she boarded, she looked out the window as the train pulled away. Her parents shrank into the gray distance until they were just two figures swallowed by winter. Alina pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She had written one honest sentence. And in the Soviet Union of 1976, that was enough to change the course of a life forever. If this story moved you, if it reminded you how fragile freedom once was, and how easily a single sentence could alter the fate of a family, then make sure you stay with this channel. Subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of forgotten Cold War lives, where ordinary people were caught in the gears of powerful systems. Like the video, share it with someone who cares about history, and tell me in the comments which hidden stories from the Soviet era you want uncovered next. Your support helps keep these stories alive, so they are never erased, never softened, and never forgotten.